He saw everyone ignore the deaf young woman. A silent dismissal he witnessed time and again. He finally asked for her hand in marriage when he understood that her quiet world held a depth and grace the noisy crowd could never perceive. In that realization, he saw not a limitation, but the very reason to build a life where she would always be heard. What you're about to hear today might change the way you see things. But first, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the ending. The grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria gleamed under the soft light of crystal chandeliers filled with Manhattan's elite gathered for the annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala. Men in tailored tuxedos and women draped in designer gowns moved through the space like dancers in an elaborate ballet, their conversations punctuated by the gentle clinking of champagne glasses and refined laughter. Marcus Sterling adjusted his bow tie and surveyed the room with the practiced eye of someone born into this world. At 28, he had inherited not only his father's real estate empire, but also his commanding presence at these social gatherings. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his smile effortless, and his charm as polished as the Italian leather of his custom shoes. He was the kind of man who could work a room with ease, remembering names, making connections, and leaving behind a trail of favorable impressions. But tonight, something caught his attention that made him pause mid-conversation with a senator's wife. Near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park stood a young woman who seemed to exist in a different dimension from everyone else. While the party swirled around her in constant motion, she remained perfectly still, her gaze fixed on something beyond the glass. She was stunning, not in the obvious magazine cover way of many women at these events, but with a quiet, almost ethereal beauty that drew the eye and held it. Her auburn hair fell in soft waves past her shoulders, and she wore a simple black dress that was elegant without being flashy. What struck Marcus most, however, was her complete isolation. Person after person passed by her, groups formed and dissolved near where she stood, but no one, not a single person, acknowledged her presence. It was as if she were invisible. "Excuse me," Marcus murmured to the senator's wife, barely hearing her response as he began making his way across the room. He couldn't understand it. How could someone so beautiful, so present, be so thoroughly ignored? Was she new to this circle? Perhaps she was someone's plus one who had been abandoned by her date. As he drew closer, he noticed the way she held herself, poised and dignified, but with a subtle sadness that tugged at something in his chest. Her hands were clasped loosely in front of her, and she seemed lost in thought, observing the party with the detached interest of an outsider looking in. Marcus straightened his shoulders and put on his most charming smile. He had never met a woman he couldn't win over with the right combination of confidence and wit. This would be easy, a simple introduction, a few compliments, perhaps an invitation to dance. "Good evening," he said, approaching from her left side. "You seem to be taking a break from all the excitement. I'm Marcus Sterling." The woman turned toward him, and for a moment, Marcus felt his breath catch. Her eyes were a striking green, intelligent and alert, framed by dark lashes. She looked at him directly, her expression pleasant, but somewhat guarded. She smiled, a polite, practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but said nothing. Marcus waited for a response, his own smile beginning to feel forced. Perhaps she hadn't heard him over the ambient noise of the party. He took a step closer. "I said good evening," he repeated, raising his voice slightly. "I don't think we've met. I'm Marcus Sterling, Sterling Properties?" Again, she looked at him, that same polite smile playing on her lips. But instead of speaking, she raised her hands and began making fluid movements with her fingers. The gestures were quick and graceful, clearly meaningful, but completely incomprehensible to Marcus. A cold realization began to dawn on him. The way she was looking at him, not through him or past him, but at him with complete attention. The way she hadn't startled when he'd approached. The hand movements that were so obviously, "Oh God," he breathed, his face beginning to flush with heat. You can't," she was deaf. The woman, still making those graceful hand movements, pointed to her ear and shook her head gently, then pointed to her mouth and shook her head again. Even without understanding sign language, Marcus grasped the meaning. "I can't hear, and I can't speak." The full weight of his assumptions crashed down on him like a wave. She wasn't being snobbish or playing hard to get. She hadn't heard a single word he'd said. And now he was standing there, gaping at her like an idiot, his face burning with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry," he stammered, his usual composure completely shattered. "I didn't. I should have— God, I'm such an idiot." He began gesturing wildly with his hands, as if random movements might somehow bridge the communication gap. He pointed to himself, then to her, then made some vague hand motions that even he knew made no sense. His movements were clumsy and desperate, nothing like the fluid grace of her sign language. The woman watched his frantic attempts with what appeared to be infinite patience. There was no mockery in her expression, no annoyance at his obvious discomfort. Instead, there was something that might have been resignation, as if this scene had played out many times before. "I'm sorry," Marcus repeated, backing away. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I should have. I'll just—" Without finishing his sentence, he turned and fled, pushing through the crowd with none of his usual social grace. He could feel curious eyes following him, could imagine the whispered conversations that would follow his abrupt departure from what must have looked like a very one-sided conversation. He found refuge in the men's room, splashing cold water on his burning face and trying to process what had just happened. In 28 years of privileged living, Marcus had never encountered a situation he couldn't charm or buy his way out of. But in the space of 5 minutes, he had been completely dismantled by his own ignorance and assumptions. The worst part wasn't even his embarrassment, it was the look in her eyes. Not anger or frustration at his clumsiness, but a weary acceptance that suggested this was just another in a long series of similar encounters. How many people had approached her only to flee in confusion when they realized she was deaf? How many times had she been left standing alone after someone discovered they couldn't communicate with her in the way they expected? Marcus gripped the marble edge of the sink, staring at his reflection in the mirror. His perfectly styled hair and expensive tuxedo suddenly felt like a costume, a facade hiding his complete inadequacy in a situation that mattered. He had always prided himself on being sophisticated, worldly, capable of handling any social situation. But tonight, faced with someone who communicated differently than he did, he had revealed himself to be nothing more than an ignorant, privileged fool who fled at the first sign of something outside his experience. When he finally returned to the party, he found himself scanning the room for her auburn hair, but she was nowhere to be seen. She had vanished as quietly as she had stood there, leaving behind only the memory of his spectacular failure and a growing sense that he had missed something important, something that went far beyond his own embarrassment. For the rest of the evening, Marcus went through the motions of socializing, but his heart wasn't in it. Every conversation felt hollow, every laugh forced. He kept thinking about the woman by the window, wondering who she was, where she had gone, and why the memory of her patient smile in the face of his panic refused to leave him alone. 3 weeks had passed since the charity gala, but Marcus Sterling couldn't escape the memory of that evening. It haunted him in ways he couldn't explain or justify. He would be in the middle of a board meeting, listening to quarterly reports, when suddenly he would see those green eyes looking at him with patient understanding. He'd be reviewing contracts in his corner office overlooking Manhattan, and his mind would drift to the graceful movements of her hands as she tried to communicate with him. The more he thought about it, the more his embarrassment transformed into something deeper and more unsettling. It wasn't just the humiliation of his social blunder that kept replaying in his mind. It was the entire scene. The way every single person at that party had walked past her as if she didn't exist. The way she had stood there, beautifully dressed and obviously intelligent, yet completely invisible to the social elite of New York City. Marcus had grown up in this world, had been navigating these same social circles since he was old enough to wear a miniature tuxedo to his parents' dinner parties. He knew how these events worked, knew the intricate dance of networking and small talk that kept the wealthy and powerful connected. But he had never really noticed, how exclusive and limited that dance was. "Sir, the Hartley proposal?" Marcus blinked, realizing his assistant Jennifer was standing in his office doorway, holding a thick folder and wearing an expression of polite concern. She had probably been trying to get his attention for several minutes. "Sorry, Jen, just thinking." He gestured for her to come in. "What about Hartley?" "They're waiting for your response on the Park Avenue acquisition. The deadline is this afternoon." Marcus nodded, trying to focus on the business at hand, but even as Jennifer laid out the details of the multi-million-dollar deal, his mind kept wandering. Who was that woman? What was her story? Did she attend those events regularly, or had that been a rare appearance? Most importantly, why couldn't he stop thinking about her? After Jennifer left, Marcus found himself doing something he had never done before. He picked up his phone and called his mother. Eleanor Sterling answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the refined cadence of someone who had been groomed for high society since birth. "Marcus, darling." "What a lovely surprise. How are you?" "I'm fine, Mom. Listen, I have a question about the Children's Hospital Gala." "Oh, wasn't it wonderful?" "They raised over $2 million. Patricia Hartwell looked absolutely divine in that Oscar de la Renta. Though I must say, her choice of jewelry was rather—" "Mom," Marcus interrupted gently. "Do you remember seeing a young woman there? Auburn hair, black dress, probably late 20s? She was standing near the windows most of the evening." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Let me think. There were so many people there, darling. Was she someone important? A client's daughter, perhaps?" She was deaf, Mom. She communicated in sign language." Another pause, longer this time. Oh, yes, I think I know who you mean. Pretty girl, very quiet. I believe she was someone's guest, though I can't remember whose." "Why do you ask?" Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks again, even though his mother couldn't see him. "I tried to talk to her, but I didn't realize. I handled it very poorly." "Oh, Marcus." His mother's voice took on the tone she used when discussing social faux pas. "Well, these things happen. I'm sure she understood that you meant well. People like that are usually quite gracious about our limitations." Something about his mother's phrasing made Marcus's jaw clench. "People like what, Mom?" "You know, dear. People with challenges. They're often very understanding when we don't know how to interact with them." Marcus had to grip the phone tighter to keep his voice level. "Her challenge isn't the problem, Mom. The problem is that none of us knew how to communicate with her." "Well, of course, darling. That's what I'm saying. It's unfortunate, but what can one do? It's not as if we can all learn that hand language thing." After ending the call with his mother, Marcus sat in his office, staring out at the Manhattan skyline, her words echoing in his head. "People like that. What can one do?" The casual dismissal in her tone. The assumption that the responsibility for communication lay entirely with the deaf woman, not with the hearing people who surrounded her. For the first time in his privileged life, Marcus began to see his world from the outside. He imagined what it must be like to attend event after event where you were dressed appropriately, educated, probably more intelligent than half the people in the room, but completely cut off from every conversation, every connection, every opportunity to be seen as a full human being. The image haunted him through client dinners and business meetings. He found himself paying attention to conversations in ways he never had before, noticing how much of social and professional interaction depended on quick verbal exchanges, shared jokes, overheard comments. He realized that even if that woman, whose name he still didn't know, were the most brilliant, accomplished person in any room, she would remain invisible to people who couldn't or wouldn't find a way to communicate with her. That weekend, Marcus did something unprecedented. He canceled his standing golf game with clients and spent Saturday in his apartment, laptop open, researching. He learned that American Sign Language was a complete, complex language with its own grammar and syntax. He read about deaf culture, about the history of deaf education, about famous deaf artists and scientists and writers who had made incredible contributions to the world despite, or perhaps because of, living in a primarily visual rather than auditory universe. He discovered that deafness existed on a spectrum, that some people were born deaf while others lost their hearing later in life, that some could read lips while others couldn't, that some chose to use hearing aids or cochlear implants while others embraced their deafness as a natural part of human diversity rather than a medical condition to be fixed. The more he learned, the more ashamed he became of his reaction at the gala. He had fled not because she was lacking something, but because he was. She had tried to communicate with him in her language, and instead of recognizing the gift of that attempt, he had panicked and run. By Sunday evening, Marcus had made a decision that surprised even him. He was going to learn sign language. On Monday morning, he asked Jennifer to research ASL instructors in Manhattan. By Tuesday, he had hired Sarah Chen, a certified interpreter who taught private lessons to hearing people who wanted to communicate with deaf family members, colleagues, or friends. "What's your goal?" Sarah asked during their first meeting in Marcus's apartment. She was a petite woman in her 40s with prematurely gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Are you learning for professional reasons? Do you have a deaf family member?" Marcus hesitated. How could he explain that he was learning because he couldn't stop thinking about a woman whose name he didn't even know? Because he was haunted by his own ignorance and the casual way his entire social circle had rendered someone invisible. "I met someone," he said finally. "I realized I'd like to be able to have a conversation with her." Sarah nodded, making no judgment about his motivations. "That's a beautiful reason to learn. Let's start with the basics." As Marcus began learning to communicate with his hands instead of his voice, he discovered something unexpected. Sign language was not simply English translated into gestures. It was a completely different way of thinking, of processing information, of expressing complex ideas through space and movement and facial expression. It required him to use parts of his mind that had been dormant his entire life. But more than that, it began to change how he saw the world around him. He noticed things he had never seen before, the way people's faces conveyed meaning beyond their words, the rhythm and flow of conversation, the subtle body language that accompanied every interaction. He began to understand that he had been living in an incredibly narrow slice of human experience, assuming that his way of communicating was not just normal, but universal. 3 months into his lessons, Sarah asked him if he wanted to attend a deaf social event, a monthly gathering at a community center in Brooklyn where deaf and hard-of-hearing people came together for conversation, games, and connection. "I'm not ready," Marcus protested. His signing was still slow and clumsy, his vocabulary limited to basic conversational phrases. "You don't have to be perfect," Sarah assured him. "The community is welcoming to people who are making an effort to learn. And honestly, immersion is the best way to improve." That Friday evening, Marcus found himself in a community center in Park Slope, surrounded by dozens of people whose hands moved in animated conversation. For the first time since the Gala, he was the one who felt out of place, struggling to follow conversations, missing jokes, feeling isolated by his limited ability to communicate. But instead of fleeing, he stayed. He introduced himself haltingly to a few people, apologized repeatedly for his slow signing, and gradually began to relax into the rhythm of visual conversation. He met teachers and engineers and artists and students, parents and grandparents and teenagers, all of whom shared the common experience of navigating a world designed for hearing people. And for the first time in months, Marcus wasn't thinking about the woman from the Gala. He was too busy being present in this new world he had discovered, this community that had been invisible to him his entire life despite existing all around him. It was only on the subway ride home that he realized what had shifted. His motivation for learning sign language had started with her, with his embarrassment and his desire to somehow redeem himself for that awkward encounter. But somewhere along the way, it had become about something larger, about expanding his understanding of what it meant to be human, about challenging his assumptions about communication and connection and community. He still thought about her, still wondered who she was and whether he would ever see her again. But now, when he imagined meeting her, he didn't picture himself as a hearing man trying to communicate with a deaf woman. He pictured two people, each with their own languages and perspectives and experiences, finding a way to understand each other. The obsession hadn't faded. If anything, it had deepened. But it had transformed from a fixation on one person into a genuine curiosity about an entire world he had never known existed. And Marcus began to suspect that when he finally did encounter her again, he might discover that she had been just the beginning of a much larger journey. 6 months had passed since the charity gala, and Marcus's sign language skills had progressed from clumsy gestures to genuine conversational ability. He attended the Brooklyn deaf social gatherings regularly now, had made several friends in the community, and had even started volunteering as a reading tutor for deaf children on weekends. But despite all these new connections and experiences, he couldn't shake his curiosity about the woman who had started this journey. It was during a particularly busy week in October that Marcus made a decision he would later question. He was going to find her. The choice didn't come from a healthy place, he knew that much. It came from late nights alone in his penthouse apartment, wondering if she ever thought about their brief encounter, wondering if she had any idea that her presence had fundamentally altered the course of his life. It came from a restless feeling that his story with her was unfinished, that somewhere in the universe there was a conversation waiting to be had. Marcus had resources that most people didn't. His wealth and connections had always made certain things possible for him, and tracking down one person in New York City, especially someone who had attended a high-profile charity event, was well within his capabilities. The question wasn't whether he could find her, but whether he should. He wrestled with the ethics of it for days. Was this stalking? Was he crossing a line from genuine interest into something darker and more obsessive? Or was it simply a man trying to reconnect with someone who had made a significant impact on his life, even if that impact had been unintentional? In the end, his curiosity won. Marcus called his head of security, a former NYPD detective named Tom Rodriguez, who handled background checks and investigations for Sterling Properties. Tom was discreet, professional, and had worked for the Sterling family for over a decade. "I need you to find someone," Marcus said, feeling uncomfortable even as he spoke the words. A woman who attended the Children's Hospital Charity Gala in March, auburn hair, late 20s, deaf. She was wearing a black dress. Tom didn't ask questions. He never did. That was part of what made him good at his job. Any other identifying information? Name? Who she might have attended with? No, that's all I have. Marcus hesitated. Tom, this is personal. I need you to be particularly careful about discretion. Understood. Mr. Sterling, I'll see what I can find. 3 days later, Tom walked into Marcus's office with a thin folder. Marcus's heart rate accelerated as he took it, suddenly nervous about what he might discover. Her name is Emma Rodriguez, Tom began, and Marcus felt a strange jolt at finally knowing her name. Emma. It suited her somehow. Strong but gentle, classic without being old-fashioned. She's 27, born and raised in Queens. Parents are Maria and Carlos Rodriguez. He's a mechanic. She works for the city. Emma has been deaf since birth, graduated from Gala University with a degree in graphic design. She runs a small freelance design business from her apartment in Astoria, specializes in visual branding for small businesses. Marcus absorbed each detail hungrily. She wasn't from his world at all, wasn't an heiress or socialite or trust fund baby. She was a working professional who had built her own career, supported herself, created her own life completely independent of the social circles he moved in. How did she end up at the gala? Marcus asked. She does design work for several nonprofits. The Children's Hospital hired her to create promotional materials for their fundraising campaign. They invited her to the gala as a thank you for her work. Of course, she hadn't been someone's pity invitation or charity case. She had been there as a professional, someone whose work had contributed to the success of the event. And every single person there, including Marcus, had treated her as if she were invisible. Tom continued reading from his notes. She lives alone. No current romantic relationship that I could identify. Has a close group of friends, mostly from the deaf community. She's involved with several advocacy organizations, does volunteer work teaching art classes to deaf children. The picture that emerged was of someone living a full, meaningful life. Someone who had built her own success, maintained her own relationships, pursued her own interests. She wasn't waiting to be rescued or saved or discovered by someone like Marcus. She was already complete. There's more, Tom said, and something in his tone made Marcus look up from the folder. She attended another charity event last month, the Museum of Modern Art fundraiser. She's scheduled to be at the Whitney Biennial opening next week. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. The Whitney opening was exactly the kind of event he would normally attend. It would be natural for him to be there, wouldn't seem like he was stalking her or engineering an encounter. It would just be a coincidence. But even as he thought it, Marcus knew he was lying to himself. There would be nothing coincidental about it. He would be going specifically because she would be there, armed with knowledge about her life that she had never shared with him, prepared for a conversation she had no idea was coming. After Tom left, Marcus sat in his office holding the folder, staring at the single photograph Tom had managed to obtain. Emma at what looked like a community event. Laughing at something someone was signing to her. She looked radiant, surrounded by friends, completely at ease in her environment. She looked nothing like the isolated woman he had first encountered at the charity gala. That night, Marcus called Sarah, his sign language instructor, who had become something of a friend over the months of their lessons. "I found her," he said without preamble when she answered the phone. "Found who?" "The woman from the gala. The reason I started learning ASL." There was a long pause. "Marcus," Sarah said carefully, "how exactly did you find her?" He explained about the investigation, about the folder of information now sitting on his desk. As he talked, he could hear the concern growing in Sarah's voice. "This doesn't sound healthy," she said when he finished. "You've been learning sign language for 6 months because of a woman whose name you didn't even know? A woman you spoke to for maybe 5 minutes? It's not just about her," Marcus protested, though even as he said it, he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Learning ASL has changed my whole perspective. I've met amazing people. I'm volunteering. Marcus," Sarah interrupted gently. "All of that is wonderful. But if you're investigating this woman, following her to events, learning details about her life without her knowledge or consent, that's not healthy interest. That's obsession." The word hit Marcus like a physical blow. Obsession. Was that what this was? He thought about the months he had spent wondering about her, the way she appeared in his thoughts at random moments, the way he had convinced himself that finding her was somehow romantic rather than invasive. "What should I do?" he asked, his voice smaller than he intended. "Honestly, I think you should leave her alone. If you encounter her naturally at some point, fine. But don't manufacture a meeting based on information you obtained through investigation. That's not fair to her." After he hung up, Marcus sat in his apartment looking out at the Manhattan skyline, wrestling with Sarah's words. Everything she had said was correct. He knew that intellectually. But emotionally, he felt like there was unfinished business between him and Emma, even though she probably didn't remember him at all. He pulled out the photograph again, studying her face. In it, she looked happy, confident, surrounded by community. She looked like someone who had never needed saving, who had never been waiting for someone like him to come along and validate her existence. For the first time since he had started this journey, Marcus began to question not just his methods, but his entire motivation. Had he really learned sign language and gotten involved with the deaf community because he wanted to expand his understanding of the world? Or had it all been an elaborate justification for what was, at its core, an unhealthy fixation on a stranger? The Whitney Biennial opening was in 5 days. Marcus had to decide. Would he go and try to approach Emma with his new knowledge and skills? Or would he finally let go of the fantasy he had been nursing for 6 months? As he sat there in his expensive apartment, surrounded by the trappings of his privilege, Marcus realized that this decision would reveal something fundamental about who he really was. Was he someone who could respect another person's autonomy and right to privacy? Or was he someone who used his wealth and power to get what he wanted, regardless of the ethical implications? The answer, he knew, would determine not just whether he was worthy of Emma's attention, but whether he was worthy of the community he had spent 6 months trying to join. The deaf community valued directness, authenticity, respect for others' experiences. Showing up at an event armed with secretly obtained information about someone's private life was the antithesis of those values. Marcus closed the folder and put it in his desk drawer. He had 5 days to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. Marcus spent the next 3 days in a state of internal conflict that was foreign to him. He was accustomed to making decisions quickly and confidently, guided by clear objectives and measurable outcomes. But this situation defied his usual analytical approach. Every time he convinced himself to stay away from the Whitney opening, he would find himself imagining Emma standing alone again, surrounded by people who couldn't or wouldn't communicate with her. and every time he decided to go, Sarah's words echoed in his mind. That's not healthy interest. That's obsession. On Thursday evening, 2 days before the Whitney opening, Marcus found himself at the Brooklyn Community Center for the monthly deaf social gathering. He had become a regular fixture there over the past 6 months, and several people greeted him warmly as he arrived. The easy acceptance he had found in this community had become one of the most valuable parts of his life, and tonight he realized he was about to jeopardize it. "You seem distracted tonight," signed David Chen, Sarah's husband, and one of Marcus's first friends in the deaf community. David was a software engineer in his 50s, born deaf, with a dry sense of humor and an uncanny ability to read people's emotions. Marcus hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I'm struggling with a decision. About someone I want to see again. Want to talk about it?" They found a quiet corner, and Marcus found himself explaining the entire situation. The gala, his months of learning ASL, his investigation of Emma, his internal debate about attending the Whitney opening. As he signed, he could see David's expression growing more serious. "Let me ask you something," David said when Marcus finished. "What do you think this woman, Emma, would feel if she knew you had investigated her? If she knew you had learned details about her life without her permission?" Marcus felt his stomach clench. "She would probably feel violated, stalked." "Probably, yes. And what do you think she would feel about the fact that you learned sign language specifically to approach her?" Marcus paused, realizing he had never considered Emma's perspective on his grand gesture. "I thought she might be impressed, or touched that someone made the effort." David shook his head. "Marcus, you're a good man. I've watched you learn and grow over these months, and I've seen how genuinely you care about this community. But what you're describing isn't romantic, it's manipulative. You're planning to approach her with skills and knowledge you obtained specifically to impress her, based on information she never consented to share." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow because he recognized their truth. He had been so focused on his own feelings, his own growth, his own desire for redemption, that he had never once considered what this encounter might feel like from Emma's perspective. "What would you do?" Marcus asked. "I would leave her alone," David said without hesitation. "If you're meant to meet again, it will happen naturally, but not like this." That night, Marcus lay in bed staring at the ceiling, finally accepting what he had been avoiding for days. His feelings for Emma were based on a fantasy. He had created an entire narrative around their brief encounter, casting himself as the reformed hero who would sweep in with his newfound cultural awareness and somehow make up for the ignorance of an entire society. But Emma wasn't a character in his story. She was a real person with her own life, her own agency, her own right to choose who she wanted to interact with. Friday morning, Marcus called his assistant and told her to clear his schedule for the Whitney opening. He wasn't going. But as Friday evening approached, Marcus found himself unable to concentrate on anything. He tried to work, tried to read, tried to watch television, but his mind kept wandering to the opening happening across town. Was Emma there? Was she standing alone again while crowds of art enthusiasts discussed pieces she couldn't hear them analyzing? Was she having a wonderful time, surrounded by friends who appreciated her insights and perspectives? At 8:30 p.m., Marcus made a compromise with himself that he knew was really just another form of rationalization. He would go to the Whitney opening, but he would not approach Emma. He would simply attend the event as he normally would, and if he happened to see her, he would leave her alone unless she approached him first. Even as he dressed in his dark suit and called for his driver, Marcus knew he was lying to himself. But the pull was too strong to resist. The Whitney Museum was buzzing with the opening night energy that Marcus knew well. Artists, collectors, critics, and socialites moving through the galleries in clusters, champagne glasses in hand, voices creating a constant hum of sophisticated conversation. Marcus accepted a glass of wine from a passing server and began his circuit of the galleries, telling himself he was there to see the art. He found her in the third gallery, standing before a large abstract painting that seemed to vibrate with color and movement. She was wearing a deep blue dress that brought out her eyes, her auburn hair pulled back in a simple but elegant updo. She was alone, studying the painting with intense concentration, occasionally taking a step back or moving closer to examine different details. Marcus positioned himself across the gallery, where he could observe her without being obvious about it. He watched as other viewers came and went, most barely glancing at the piece that had captured her attention. A few people looked at her curiously, probably wondering why someone would stare at a painting for so long. But no one approached her or attempted to engage her in conversation about what she was seeing. After about 10 minutes, Marcus noticed something that made his chest tighten with recognition. A well-dressed couple in their 60s approached the painting Emma was studying. The woman made a disparaging comment about abstract art that Marcus could hear from across the gallery, and her husband laughed. They positioned themselves directly between Emma and the painting, effectively forcing her to step back. Emma moved politely aside, but Marcus could see the frustration in her posture. She had clearly been deeply engaged with the piece, and now her viewing experience had been interrupted by people who showed no awareness of her presence or interest in the art. The couple continued their loud critique of the painting, making jokes about modern art that struck Marcus as both ignorant and pretentious. Emma stood to the side, waiting for them to move on so she could return to her contemplation of the piece. But they lingered, taking photos of each other in front of the painting, treating it as a backdrop for their social media, rather than engaging with it as art. Marcus felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced at the charity gala when he realized how thoroughly Emma had been ignored. But this time, instead of fleeing from his discomfort, he found himself moving across the gallery. "Excuse me," he said to the couple, his voice polite but firm. "I think this young woman was here first." The couple looked surprised, then annoyed. The woman glanced dismissively at Emma, then back at Marcus. "I'm sorry, was she saying something? We didn't hear her ask us to move." The casual cruelty of the comment, the assumption that because Emma couldn't speak, she had no right to gallery space or consideration, hit Marcus like a slap. But before he could respond, Emma stepped forward. She looked directly at the woman and began signing, her movements sharp and deliberate. Marcus could understand enough to catch the general meaning. She was explaining that she had been studying the painting and would appreciate the opportunity to continue. The woman stared at Emma's hands with a mixture of confusion and discomfort. "I'm sorry, I don't understand that." "Hand thing," she said, her tone suggesting that Emma's method of communication was somehow an imposition on her. "She's asking if she can return to viewing the painting," Marcus translated, his voice carefully controlled. "She was here first, and she's been studying this piece for quite some time." The couple exchanged glances, clearly annoyed at being called out for their rudeness. "Well, it's a public gallery," the man said defensively. "Anyone can look at any painting they want." "You're absolutely right," Marcus replied smoothly. "Anyone can look. But perhaps we could all be a bit more considerate of each other's experience." After some grumbling, the couple moved on to the next gallery. Marcus turned to Emma, intending to offer a brief apology for interfering, but found her looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. She tilted her head slightly, studying his face, and Marcus realized with a jolt that she might recognize him from the gala 6 months earlier. His heart began to race as he tried to decide what to do. Then Emma raised her hands and signed something that made Marcus's breath catch. "Thank you. That was kind of you." Her signing was clear and deliberate, and Marcus realized she had signed it specifically for his benefit. She somehow knew he could understand her. "You're welcome," he signed back, his hands moving more smoothly than they ever had before. "I'm sorry they were so rude." Emma's eyes widened slightly at his fluent response, and Marcus saw the exact moment when recognition dawned. She remembered him, the awkward man who had fled from her at the charity gala. "You learned," she signed, and there was wonder in her expression. "I learned," Marcus confirmed, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she must be able to see it. "I'm Marcus Sterling. We sort of met at the Children's Hospital Gala in March." A small smile played at the corners of Emma's mouth. "I remember. You seemed panicked." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he forced himself to maintain eye contact. "I was mortified by my own ignorance. I'm sorry for running away like that." "Apology accepted," Emma signed. "Your ASL is very good. How long have you been learning?" Here was the moment of truth. Marcus could lie, could downplay the timeline, could pretend his learning had been motivated by something other than her. But standing there in front of her, seeing the genuine curiosity and openness in her expression, he found he couldn't do anything but tell the truth. 6 months, he signed, since the night I met you. Emma's hands stilled, and Marcus saw surprise, then something more complex, a mixture of flattery and concern, cross her features. You learned sign language because of our 30-second encounter? She asked. I learned sign language because I realized how limited my world was, Marcus replied carefully. But yes, meeting you was the catalyst. They stood there for a moment in silence, the painting behind them forgotten, as Emma processed this information. Marcus waited, trying to read her expression, wondering if he had just made another terrible mistake. Finally, Emma signed, That's either very sweet or very concerning. Despite his nervousness, Marcus laughed. Probably a little of both, he admitted. Emma studied him for another moment, then made a decision that would change both of their lives. Would you like to tell me about it? There's a coffee shop around the corner that stays open late. The coffee shop Emma led him to was a small, intimate place called Grind, tucked between a bookstore and a vintage clothing boutique. It was the kind of establishment Marcus would normally never notice. Too small, too casual, lacking the polished veneer of the places where he usually conducted his social and business interactions. But as they settled into a corner booth with their drinks, Marcus realized this was exactly the kind of place where real conversations happened. Emma cupped her hands around a large ceramic mug of herbal tea, studying Marcus across the small table. In the softer lighting of the coffee shop, away from the formal atmosphere of the gallery, she seemed more relaxed, more herself. But there was still a wariness in her eyes that Marcus recognized, the careful assessment of someone who had learned not to trust too quickly. So, she signed, tell me about these 6 months. Marcus had rehearsed this conversation in his head dozens of times, but now that it was actually happening, all his prepared explanations seemed inadequate. How could he explain the way that brief encounter had haunted him without sounding obsessive? How could he describe the journey he had taken without making it seem like he was trying to impress her? After I met you, he began, his signing still careful but increasingly confident, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. Not just about my embarrassing reaction, but about what I had witnessed. You were standing alone in a room full of people who completely ignored you, not because you weren't worth talking to, but because we didn't know how to communicate with you. Emma nodded, her expression neutral. That happens a lot, she signed matter-of-factly. I'm used to it. But you shouldn't have to be, Marcus replied, feeling a familiar surge of frustration on her behalf. That's what bothered me so much. Here you were, probably more intelligent and interesting than half the people in that room, but you were invisible to them because they couldn't be bothered to learn how to include you. And you decided to be different? There was something in Emma's expression that Marcus couldn't quite read. Not skepticism exactly, but not complete acceptance either. I decided to educate myself, Marcus said carefully. I hired an ASL instructor. I started attending deaf community events. I learned about deaf culture, deaf history, the way society has treated deaf people throughout history. What did you learn? Emma asked, and Marcus sensed this was somehow a test. He took a deep breath, trying to organize 6 months of revelations into something coherent. I learned that deafness isn't a disability to be pitied or fixed. It's a different way of experiencing the world that has its own richness and complexity. I learned that American Sign Language isn't just English translated into gestures, but a complete language with its own grammar and poetry and humor. I learned that the deaf community has its own culture, its own values, its own way of understanding what it means to be human. Emma's posture relaxed slightly as he spoke. Go on, she signed. I learned that I had been living in an incredibly narrow world, Marcus continued, warming to his subject. I had assumed that my way of communicating, my perspective, my experiences were somehow universal. But spending time with the deaf community showed me that there are as many ways of being human as there are humans, and that most of the barriers between people aren't natural or necessary. They're created by ignorance and lack of effort. That's a lot to learn in 6 months, Emma observed. It's been the most educational 6 months of my life, Marcus admitted. But it also made me realize something uncomfortable about myself. Which is? Marcus hesitated, then decided to continue with honesty. I realized that my initial motivation wasn't pure. I started learning ASL because I wanted to redeem myself for that embarrassing encounter with you. I had this fantasy that I would find you again and somehow impress you with my newfound cultural awareness. I was still making it about me, about what I wanted, about how I could fix my wounded ego. Emma's eyebrows rose slightly. And now? Now I realize that was incredibly selfish, Marcus said, his signing becoming more animated as he tried to express his genuine regret. The deaf community isn't there for me to feel better about myself. You're not a project for me to work on or a problem for me to solve. You're a complete person with your own life and your own agency. And I had no right to insert myself into your world based on a 5-minute encounter where you were probably just being polite to a confused stranger. For the first time since they sat down, Emma smiled, really smiled, not just the polite expression she had been maintaining. You really did learn a lot, she signed. I'm still learning, Marcus replied, and I'm still making mistakes. Like tonight, I told myself I was going to the Whitney opening just to see the art, but really I was hoping I would see you. I investigated you, Emma. I had you looked into by a private detective. I know where you work, where you live, what university you attended. I know it was wrong, but I was obsessed with the idea of seeing you again. Marcus watched Emma's expression change as he spoke, saw the wariness return to her eyes. This was the moment where she would either walk away, which she had every right to do, or somehow find a way to forgive his violations of her privacy. You had me investigated? Emma's signing was sharp, precise, conveying her discomfort clearly. Yes, Marcus admitted, meeting her eyes directly. I'm not proud of it. My ASL instructor told me it was unhealthy behavior, that I should leave you alone. She was right, but I couldn't let go of the idea that there was something unfinished between us. Emma sat back in the booth, studying him with an expression that Marcus couldn't read. The silence stretched between them, filled with the ambient noise of the coffee shop, conversations in spoken English, the hiss of the espresso machine, the scraping of chairs across the floor. For Emma, Marcus realized the silence was probably complete. What kind of information did you find out about me? Emma finally asked. Marcus felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment, but he forced himself to continue being honest. Your full name, where you grew up, your educational background, your work as a graphic designer, the fact that you do volunteer work with deaf children, that you were at the charity gala because you had done design work for the children's hospital. Anything else? That you live alone, that you're not currently in a relationship. Marcus paused, then added, I'm ashamed of myself for having that information. You never consented to share any of it with me. Emma nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful rather than angry. You're right, she signed. It was a violation of my privacy, but I appreciate your honesty about it. I almost didn't tell you, Marcus admitted. I thought about approaching you tonight as if it were a coincidence, pretending I knew nothing about your life. But that would have been even more manipulative. Yes, it would have been, Emma agreed. So what do you want now, Marcus Sterling of Sterling Properties? The question hung between them, and Marcus realized that for the first time in 6 months he didn't have a clear answer. All his fantasies had been focused on finding her, approaching her, having this conversation. He had never thought seriously about what would come next. I want to get to know you, he said finally. The real you, not the version I've created in my imagination based on limited information and my own projections. I want to understand your world, your perspective, your experiences. But more than that, I want to know if there's any possibility that you might want to get to know me too. Emma took a sip of her tea, her eyes never leaving his face. What if the answer is no? She asked. What if, after getting to know me, you discover that I'm not the person you've been imagining? What if I'm boring or difficult or not interested in you romantically? Then I'll have learned something valuable about myself and about making assumptions about people, Marcus replied. And hopefully I'll have gained a friend and continued to expand my understanding of the world. And if I decide that your investigation of my private life crosses a line I can't forgive, if I decide I don't want anything to do with you, Marcus felt his chest tighten, but he forced himself to meet her gaze. Then I'll respect that decision completely. I'll leave you alone, and I'll take the lesson about consent and boundaries that I clearly need to learn. Emma nodded, seeming to appreciate his directness. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, Emma apparently weighing her options, while Marcus tried to prepare himself for possible rejection. I have conditions, Emma finally signed. Marcus felt a surge of hope mixed with nervousness. I'm listening. First, no more investigating me. If you want to know something about my life, ask me directly. I'll decide what I want to share and when. Absolutely, Marcus agreed immediately. Second, I want to know about your world too. You've spent 6 months learning about deaf culture, but I know almost nothing about what it's like to be Marcus Sterling. If we're going to get to know each other, it needs to be mutual. Of course, Marcus nodded. Third, I'm not a charity case or an inspiration or a project. I'm a person with my own interests, opinions, and flaws. I'm not interested in being anyone's good deed or cultural awakening. Understood, Marcus signed, recognizing the truth in her words. And fourth, Emma continued, her expression becoming more serious. I need you to understand that this, she gestured between them, might not go anywhere romantic. I might decide I'm not interested in you that way, or you might discover that your feelings were based more on fantasy than reality. Can you handle that possibility? Marcus considered her question carefully. 6 months ago, he would have immediately assured her that his feelings were genuine, that he was certain about his attraction to her. But the learning process had taught him to be more honest with himself about his own motivations and limitations. I think my feelings are genuine, he said slowly. But I also think they're based on very limited information and a lot of projection on my part. You're right that I might have created a fantasy version of you that has little to do with who you really are. So yes, I can handle the possibility that this might not become romantic. What I can't handle is not finding out who you really are. Emma smiled again, and this time it reached her eyes. Okay, she signed. Let's see what happens. As they left the coffee shop together, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Genuine anticipation without the weight of obsession. For the first time since that night at the charity gala, he wasn't thinking about Emma as a puzzle to solve or a goal to achieve. He was simply looking forward to getting to know another person, with all the uncertainty and possibility that entailed. Can I ask you something? Emma signed as they stood on the sidewalk outside the coffee shop. Anything, Marcus replied. What was it like for you, learning to communicate in a completely different way? What was the hardest part? Marcus thought about her question, appreciating its depth. The hardest part was realizing how much of my identity was tied up in being verbal, in being able to dominate conversations, in using words to control situations. Learning to communicate with my hands, with my face, with my whole body, it required me to be more present, more genuine. I couldn't hide behind verbal cleverness or social conditioning. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. Emma nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly what I hoped you would say, she signed. As Marcus watched her disappear into the subway station, he realized that the real journey was just beginning. The past 6 months had been preparation, not for winning Emma's affection, but for becoming someone worthy of genuine human connection, regardless of where that connection might lead. Over the next 3 months, Marcus and Emma developed what could only be described as an unconventional friendship. They met for coffee every Tuesday evening at Grind, the little shop where they had had their first real conversation. Emma had suggested the regular schedule, explaining that consistency was important to her. She liked knowing when and where things would happen, partly because so much of her social life depended on planned interactions rather than spontaneous encounters. These Tuesday meetings became the highlight of Marcus's week, though not for the reasons he had initially expected. Rather than being romantic interludes filled with increasing intimacy, they were intensive cultural exchanges where two people from completely different worlds tried to understand each other's experiences. Emma proved to be nothing like the fantasy version Marcus had created in his mind. She was funnier than he had imagined, with a sharp wit that she expressed through both signing and facial expressions. She was also more challenging. She didn't hesitate to call him out when his privilege showed, when he made assumptions, or when he spoke about deaf culture in ways that revealed his outsider perspective. You're doing it again, she signed one Tuesday evening in November, interrupting Marcus mid-sentence. Doing what? He asked, genuinely confused. Talking about the deaf community like you're an anthropologist studying an exotic tribe, Emma replied, her signing carrying an edge of frustration. You say they do this, and they believe that instead of we or my friends. You're still positioning yourself as an outsider looking in. Marcus felt his cheeks flush. I don't want to appropriate. There's a difference between appropriation and participation, Emma interrupted. You've been part of the community for 8 months now. You have deaf friends. You volunteer with deaf children. You understand the culture and respect it. At some point, you have to decide whether you're going to remain a perpetual tourist or actually commit to being part of something. The conversation stayed with Marcus for days. He realized that Emma was right. Despite all his learning and involvement, he was still holding himself apart, still viewing deaf culture as something foreign that he was visiting, rather than something he was genuinely joining. It was another layer of privilege he hadn't recognized, the ability to engage with a community while maintaining the safety net of being able to leave whenever it became uncomfortable or inconvenient. The next week, when David Chen asked Marcus to help organize a fundraiser for deaf education programs, Marcus said yes without hesitation. When the local deaf theater group asked him to help with publicity for their upcoming production, he offered to use his business connections to get them media coverage. For the first time, instead of just learning about the community, he began contributing to it. Emma noticed the shift immediately. You seem different, she observed during one of their Tuesday meetings. More settled. I feel different, Marcus admitted. I think I was so worried about not belonging that I never allowed myself to actually belong. And now? Marcus considered her question. Now I realize that belonging isn't something that gets granted to you by other people. It's something you choose, and then you do the work to earn it. Their conversations weren't one-sided, though. True to her word, Emma had begun asking Marcus about his world with the same curiosity and directness that he had initially brought to learning about hers. Her questions often caught him off guard because they focused on aspects of his life that he had never considered worth examining. What's it like to inherit a business? She asked one evening. Not the money part. I mean, what's it like to have your entire career path determined before you're old enough to choose? Marcus had never thought about his inheritance in those terms. I guess I always saw it as an advantage, he said slowly. Security, opportunity, a head start in life. But what about choice? Emma pressed. Did you ever want to do something else? Be someone else? I don't think I ever allowed myself to want something different, Marcus realized as he spoke. It would have seemed ungrateful or irresponsible. That sounds like a kind of prison, Emma observed. A very comfortable, privileged prison, but still. These conversations forced Marcus to examine his life in ways he never had before. He began to see how his wealth and social position had both opened doors and closed off possibilities. He had access to opportunities that most people could only dream of, but he had also been constrained by expectations and assumptions about who he should be and what he should want. I think I've been living someone else's life, he told Emma one Tuesday in December, the realization hitting him as he spoke the words. My father's life, or the life that people expected Marcus Sterling to live. But I'm not sure I've ever stopped to think about what I actually want. So what do you want? Emma asked. It was such a simple question, but Marcus found himself unable to answer it immediately. He had spent so many years focusing on what he should want, success in business, social status, the approval of his peers, that he had lost touch with his own desires and interests. I want to do work that matters, he said finally. I want to use my resources and connections to create opportunities for people who don't have the advantages I was born with. I want to be part of something bigger than just accumulating wealth. That's very noble, Emma signed, but there was something in her expression that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. You don't believe me, Marcus observed. I believe that you mean it, Emma replied carefully. But wanting to help people and actually doing it effectively are very different things. Good intentions aren't enough if they're not paired with genuine understanding and respect for the people you're trying to help. Her words stung. but Marcus recognized their truth. How many wealthy people had he met over the years who talked about their charitable work as if they were saviors bestowing gifts upon the less fortunate? How many times had he seen well-meaning initiatives fail because they were designed by people who had never bothered to ask the intended beneficiaries what they actually needed? "You're right," he admitted. "I don't want to be another rich guy who thinks his money automatically makes him qualified to solve other people's problems." "So what are you going to do about it?" Marcus spent the next several weeks thinking about Emma's challenge. He realized that his months of learning about deaf culture had taught him something valuable: the importance of listening before acting, of understanding a community from the inside rather than making assumptions from the outside. He began reaching out to organizations he had supported financially in the past, asking not how much money they needed, but how he could contribute his time and skills. He volunteered at a homeless shelter, not as a board member making policy decisions, but as someone serving meals and listening to stories. He tutored kids in underserved schools, learning about educational challenges from teachers who lived them every day rather than from academic reports. The work was humbling in ways Marcus hadn't expected. It forced him to confront his own assumptions about poverty, education, and social mobility. It showed him how little his Ivy League education had taught him about the realities of most people's lives. But it also began to give him a sense of purpose that his business success had never provided. Emma watched his transformation with what seemed like a mixture of approval and amusement. "You're becoming a different person," she observed one Tuesday evening in January. "Is that good or bad?" Marcus asked. "It's real," Emma replied. "For the first time since I've known you, you seem like you're living your own life instead of playing a role." Marcus felt something shift in his chest at her words. Over the months of their friendship, his feelings for Emma had evolved from obsession to genuine affection, but he had been careful not to push for anything beyond friendship. She had been clear about her boundaries, and he had respected them. But sitting across from her in their familiar coffee shop, seeing the approval in her eyes as she recognized his growth, Marcus felt a new kind of hope. "Emma," he began, then stopped himself. He had been about to tell her how he felt, to ask if her feelings toward him had changed as he had changed. But he caught himself, remembering her warnings about not making assumptions, about respecting her agency. "What?" she asked, noticing his hesitation. "Nothing," Marcus said, then immediately corrected himself. "Actually, that's not true. I was about to say something about my feelings for you, but then I remembered that you asked me to be patient, to let things develop naturally." Emma smiled at his honesty. "I appreciate that you caught yourself," she signed. "But I also appreciate that you told me what you were thinking, instead of pretending it was nothing." "It's hard sometimes," Marcus admitted. "Being patient when I feel like I've changed so much, when I feel like we've built something meaningful together." "We have built something meaningful," Emma agreed. "We've built a friendship based on mutual respect and genuine understanding." "That's not a small thing, Marcus." "No," he agreed. "It's not." As they prepared to leave that evening, Emma paused at the door of the coffee shop. "Marcus?" she signed. "Yes?" "Thank you. For what?" "For becoming someone worth knowing," she replied. And Marcus felt his heart expand with a warmth that had nothing to do with romantic love and everything to do with human connection. Walking home through the Manhattan streets, Marcus realized that Emma had given him something more valuable than romance. She had challenged him to become the person he was capable of being. Whether or not their relationship ever developed beyond friendship, he would always be grateful for the way she had refused to accept the limited version of himself he had been living with for 28 years. The transformation wasn't complete. Marcus suspected it might be a lifelong process, but for the first time in his adult life, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. And that, he realized, was worth more than all the money in his trust fund. The first time Marcus brought Emma as his guest to a high society event, he thought he was prepared for what they might encounter. After 9 months of friendship and immersion in deaf culture, he believed he understood the challenges Emma faced in hearing-dominated spaces. He was wrong. The event was the annual Metropolitan Museum Gala in February, one of the most exclusive social gatherings in New York. Marcus had attended for years. moving easily through the crowds of Manhattan's elite, making connections, representing sterling properties with the polished charm that had been bred into him. This year, he had asked Emma to accompany him, not as a romantic gesture, but because she had expressed curiosity about his world, and he wanted her to see this side of his life. "Are you sure about this?" Emma had asked when he invited her. "I don't exactly blend in at these kinds of events." "Neither do most of the people there, honestly," Marcus had replied. "They just hide it better behind expensive clothes and practiced conversation." Emma had agreed, with the condition that Marcus wouldn't feel obligated to stay by her side all evening. "I don't want to be your responsibility," she had signed. "If we go together, we go as equals who happen to be attending the same event." Marcus had readily agreed, confident in his ability to navigate his social circles while ensuring Emma felt included and comfortable. He had not anticipated how profoundly the experience would change his understanding of both his world and hers. The problems began the moment they arrived. The coat check attendant, seeing Emma sign her thanks, immediately looked to Marcus for guidance, as if Emma were somehow incapable of managing her own coat check slip. When Marcus started to explain that Emma could handle her own ticket, the attendant interrupted him with a patronizing smile. "Oh, it's so wonderful that you bring her to these events," the young woman gushed. "She must feel so grateful to be included." Marcus felt his jaw clench, but before he could respond, Emma stepped forward and handed the attendant a business card, her professional card identifying her as a graphic designer. She pointed to the event program in the attendant's hand, then to her own card, indicating that she had designed the promotional materials for the evening. The attendant's smile faltered as she realized Emma wasn't a charity case Marcus had brought along, but a professional who had contributed to the event. But instead of adjusting her attitude, she became flustered and dismissive, waving them toward the main gallery without acknowledging Emma's professional connection to the evening. "Welcome to my world," Emma signed to Marcus as they walked away, her expression wry but not surprised. The pattern continued throughout the evening. At the cocktail reception, Marcus watched as people formed conversation circles around them that somehow always excluded Emma. Not intentionally, perhaps, but through a series of small actions that effectively rendered her invisible, turning their backs to her when they spoke, failing to make eye contact when Marcus attempted to include her in conversations, speaking over her when she tried to contribute through Marcus's interpretation. The most painful moment came when Marcus was speaking with Robert Hartwell, a real estate developer whose family had been friends with the Sterlings for decades. Marcus was trying to include Emma in their conversation about urban development, explaining her perspective on visual communication in public spaces, when Robert interrupted him mid-sentence. "Marcus, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Robert asked, his tone suggesting it wasn't really a request. They stepped aside, leaving Emma standing alone by the bar. Marcus could see her resignation in the set of her shoulders. She knew exactly what was happening. "Listen, son," Robert said in the condescending tone he had used with Marcus since childhood. "I think it's admirable what you're doing here. Really generous of you to bring that girl and all. But maybe next time you could find a more appropriate venue. These events are for networking, for serious business discussions. Having to accommodate her special needs makes things complicated for everyone." Marcus felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. "Accommodate her special needs?" he repeated, his voice carefully controlled. "You know what I mean," Robert continued, oblivious to Marcus's growing anger. The hand waving, having to translate everything, people not knowing how to interact with her. It's awkward for everyone involved. There are other charities, other ways to help people like that without bringing them into situations where they don't really belong. "People like what exactly?" Marcus asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "Oh, come on, Marcus. Don't be obtuse. She's deaf. This isn't her world. Look around. She's been standing alone for 10 minutes because no one knows how to talk to her. You're not doing her any favors by putting her in uncomfortable situations." Marcus looked across the room at Emma, who was indeed standing alone, studying one of the museum pieces while the party swirled around her. But what Robert saw as exclusion and discomfort, Marcus now recognized as something else: dignity. Emma wasn't cowering or looking lost. She was observing, thinking, engaging with the art in ways that the champagne-fueled socializing around her probably couldn't match. "You're right about one thing," Marcus said, turning back to Robert. "She doesn't belong here, but not for the reasons you think." "What do you mean?" "She doesn't belong here because she's too intelligent, too genuine, and too accomplished to waste her time with people who think someone's worth is determined by whether they communicate the same way you do." Robert's face reddened. "Now see here, Marcus." "No, you see here," Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying the authority he had inherited along with his wealth. "Emma Rodriguez is a successful graphic designer who created the promotional materials for tonight's event. She's more culturally aware, more socially conscious, and frankly more interesting than 90% of the people in this room. The fact that she communicates in ASL instead of English doesn't make her less than anyone here. It makes everyone here less for not knowing how to communicate with her." The conversation ended with Robert stalking away, muttering about Marcus losing perspective and getting too involved with those people. But Marcus barely noticed. He was too busy watching Emma, seeing his world through her eyes for the first time. He observed as waiter after waiter approached other guests, but walked past Emma, assuming she wouldn't be able to place an order. He watched as a prominent art collector discussed the very painting Emma was studying, discussing it loudly and incorrectly, without ever acknowledging her presence or asking for her perspective. He saw the way people's eyes slid over her, the way conversations stopped when she approached, the way his entire social circle had unconsciously but systematically excluded her from every interaction. And then he saw something that made his chest tighten with shame. His own mother approaching Emma with the careful, overly bright expression people use when they think they're being kind to someone they consider less fortunate. "You must be Emma," Eleanor Sterling exclaimed, speaking slowly and loudly as if Emma were a child. "Marcus has told me so much about you. It's so inspiring how you've overcome your challenges to have such a normal life." Marcus moved quickly to intervene, but not quickly enough to prevent Emma from experiencing the full weight of his mother's well-intentioned condescension. He arrived just as Emma was signing a response that his mother, of course, couldn't understand. "What is she saying?" Eleanor asked Marcus, still maintaining that bright, patronizing smile. "She's saying that she appreciates meeting you," Marcus translated, though Emma had actually signed something far less polite about people who spoke about her as if she weren't present. "Oh, how lovely!" Eleanor gushed. "And she does it all with her hands." "Remarkable." Marcus saw Emma's jaw tighten slightly, the only sign of her frustration that she allowed to show. His mother continued chattering about how wonderful it was that people like Emma could lead such fulfilling lives, how much progress society had made in helping the disabled, and how proud she was of Marcus for being so charitable. When his mother finally moved on to greet other guests, Marcus turned to Emma, expecting to see anger or hurt. Instead, he found her looking at him with something that might have been pity. "Now you understand," she signed. "I'm so sorry," Marcus replied, feeling inadequate in both English and ASL. "I had no idea it would be this bad." "This isn't bad," Emma corrected him. "This is actually pretty typical. People are being polite, even kind, by their own standards. That's what makes it so insidious." Marcus looked around the elegant gallery with new eyes, seeing the casual cruelty hidden beneath the polished manners and expensive clothes. These people weren't actively malicious. They were worse than that. They were indifferent. They had collectively decided that anyone who didn't communicate in their preferred mode was somehow less worthy of consideration, less deserving of respect, less human. "Do you want to leave?" Marcus asked, hoping she would say yes, suddenly desperate to escape the suffocating prejudice of his own social circle. "No," Emma replied, surprising him. "I want to stay. I want to see how you handle this." "What do you mean?" "I mean, this is who these people really are when they think no one important is watching. This is what I deal with in your world, Marcus. The question is, are you going to continue being part of it, or are you going to do something about it?" For the rest of the evening, Marcus found himself in the strange position of seeing his lifelong social circle as outsiders for the first time. He watched his friends and colleagues reveal their casual bigotry through 1,000 small interactions. He heard the jokes about hand-waving and special needs that he had never noticed before. He witnessed the systematic exclusion of anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of normal. But more importantly, he began to understand something Emma had been trying to teach him for months. That true allyship wasn't about learning to communicate with marginalized communities. It was about challenging the systems that marginalized them in the first place. When Robert Hartwell approached him later in the evening to apologize for their earlier conversation, Marcus didn't accept the apology gracefully, as he would have in the past. "I don't think you understand what you're apologizing for," Marcus said calmly. "Well, I may have been a bit harsh about your friend." "Emma isn't my friend because I'm being charitable," Marcus interrupted. "She's my friend because she's an exceptional person. The problem isn't that she doesn't belong in spaces like this. The problem is that spaces like this aren't worthy of her." Robert's attempted reconciliation ended with him walking away, confused and offended. Marcus found he didn't care. As they left the gala that evening, Emma was unusually quiet. It wasn't until they were in Marcus's car that she finally spoke. "That was harder for you than it was for me," she observed. "How can you say that?" Marcus asked. "They treated you terribly." "They treated me exactly the way I expected to be treated," Emma replied. "But you had to watch people you've known your entire life reveal who they really are. That's much more painful." Marcus considered her words as his driver navigated the Manhattan traffic. She was right. The evening had been a revelation about his own community, his own family, his own complicity in systems of exclusion he had never bothered to notice. "I can't keep being part of this," he said finally. "You don't have to stop being wealthy, Marcus," Emma signed with a slight smile. "You just have to stop pretending that wealth makes people better than anyone else." That night, Marcus lay awake thinking about the evening, about Robert Hartwell's casual dismissal of Emma's humanity, about his mother's condescending kindness, about his own years of participation in conversations and systems that treated entire communities as invisible or less than. He thought about Emma's dignity in the face of systematic exclusion, her patience with his learning process, her refusal to let him off the hook for his own privilege. By morning, he had made a decision that would change the trajectory of his life. He was going to use his position and resources not just to support marginalized communities, but to actively challenge the systems that marginalize them. And he was going to start with his own social circle, his own family, his own assumptions about what it meant to belong in the world. The transformation Emma had started in him was no longer just personal. It was becoming political. And Marcus was beginning to understand that true love, whether romantic or platonic, required not just understanding another person's world, but working to change the systems that made that world more difficult than it needed to be. The revelation came not during a dramatic moment or passionate conversation, but on a quiet Thursday evening in March, almost exactly 1 year after Marcus had first encountered Emma at the charity gala. He was sitting in the community center in Brooklyn, watching Emma coordinate a performance that would become a turning point in his understanding of everything he thought he knew about strength, independence, and what it meant to be complete. The event was called Voices in Motion, a showcase of deaf performers presenting poetry, storytelling, and dance entirely in American Sign Language. Emma had been organizing it for months, working with local deaf artists to create an evening that would demonstrate the richness and beauty of visual language to both deaf and hearing audiences. Marcus had offered to help with funding and logistics, but Emma had gently declined most of his assistance. "This needs to come from the community," she had explained. "If hearing people, even well-meaning ones, take over the planning and execution, it becomes about what you think we should show you rather than what we want to share." He had accepted her decision, though he struggled with feeling useless. His instinct was always to help, to solve problems, to use his resources to make things easier. Learning to step back and let others lead had been one of the most difficult lessons of the past year. Tonight, as he sat in the audience watching Emma move seamlessly between roles, director, coordinator, interpreter, mediator, Marcus finally understood something that had been eluding him for months. Emma stood at the center of a complex production involving dozens of performers, technical crew, and volunteers. She was simultaneously translating for hearing sound technicians, coordinating lighting cues with deaf performers, managing schedule changes, and ensuring that every aspect of the show would be accessible to both deaf and hearing audience members. Marcus watched her solve problem after problem with grace and efficiency. When the ASL interpreter for hearing audience members arrived late, Emma quickly reorganized the setup to accommodate the delay. When a technical issue with the lighting threatened to disrupt a visual poem, she worked with the performer to adapt the piece in real time. When a hearing volunteer became flustered, trying to communicate with deaf crew members, Emma stepped in to facilitate understanding without making anyone feel inadequate. What struck Marcus most profoundly was not just Emma's competence, though she was clearly in her element, but the way everyone around her naturally looked to her for leadership. Deaf and hearing people alike sought her guidance, trusted her judgment, relied on her expertise. She wasn't just participating in this community, she was helping to lead it. The performance itself was transformative. Marcus watched poetry come alive through movement and expression, saw stories told with a physicality and visual richness that spoken language couldn't match. He witnessed deaf performers command the stage with a presence and authority that made the hearing world's obsession with auditory communication seem suddenly limited and narrow. But the real revelation came during the final piece of the evening, a collaborative poem performed by 5 deaf artists telling the story of deaf experience in America. As Marcus watched the performers weave together themes of isolation and community, struggle and triumph, marginalization and resistance, he realized something that stopped his breath. Emma had never been the isolated, lonely figure he had first encountered at the charity gala. She had never been someone who needed saving or helping or inclusion from the hearing world. She was part of a vibrant, complex, accomplished community that existed entirely independent of hearing people's awareness or approval. The reason she had been standing alone at that gala wasn't because she was lost or excluded from her own community. It was because she was temporarily outside of it, in a space that couldn't recognize her value or understand her language. She hadn't been waiting for someone like Marcus to rescue her from isolation. She had been enduring the temporary discomfort of being in a world that was too limited to appreciate what she had to offer. As the performance concluded and the audience erupted in applause, both clapped and signed, Marcus felt a fundamental shift in his understanding that was almost physical in its intensity. Everything he had believed about Emma, about deaf people, about who needed help and who needed saving, had been turned completely upside down. During the reception after the show, Marcus found himself in conversation with Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a deaf professor of linguistics at Columbia University who had attended the performance. "Beautiful evening," Marcus signed, still processing what he had witnessed. "Emma did an amazing job organizing this," Dr. Martinez agreed. "She's become such an important voice in our community. Her advocacy work with deaf education policy has been groundbreaking." Marcus felt a familiar jolt of realization. There was still so much about Emma's life and work that he didn't know. "Advocacy work? Oh yes," Dr. Martinez continued. "She's been working with the state legislature on expanding ASL education in public schools, fighting to get deaf history included in curricula, pushing for better accessibility standards in public spaces." She testified before Congress last month about employment discrimination against deaf workers. Marcus absorbed this information, feeling simultaneously proud of Emma and ashamed of his own ignorance. Even after a year of friendship, he was still discovering the depth and scope of her professional and personal accomplishments. "She never mentioned any of that to me," he admitted. Dr. Martinez studied him with interest. "You're the hearing friend she's talked about, the one who learned ASL?" "I suppose so," Marcus replied, not sure how Emma had described him to others in the community. "She speaks very highly of you," Dr. Martinez said. "She says you're one of the few hearing people she's met who actually listen to learn rather than listen to respond." Before Marcus could ask what that meant, Emma appeared beside them, her face flushed with the success of the evening and the energy of coordinating such a complex event. "How did you like the show?" she asked Marcus, her signing animated with excitement. "It was incredible," Marcus replied honestly. "But more than that, it was revelatory." "Revelatory how?" Marcus looked around the room at the deaf community celebrating together, artists and teachers, students and professionals, families and friends, all connected by shared language and culture and experience. He saw Emma at the center of it all, not as someone on the margins of society, but as someone at the heart of her own rich and complex world. "I finally understand," he signed slowly, trying to find the right words. "You were never alone at that charity gala. You weren't isolated or excluded from community. You were just temporarily in a space that didn't know how to recognize what you brought to it." Emma's expression grew serious as she followed his reasoning. "I thought I was learning about your world so I could help you navigate mine," Marcus continued. "But really I was learning that my world, the hearing world, is much smaller and more limited than I ever imagined. You don't need to be included in spaces that can't appreciate you. Those spaces need to become worthy of your presence." Emma studied his face for a long moment, and Marcus saw something shift in her expression, a recognition perhaps, that he had finally grasped something essential that she had been trying to teach him for months. "Do you know what the hardest part of being deaf is?" she asked him. Marcus shook his head, knowing that whatever he might guess would probably be wrong. "It's not the inability to hear," Emma explained. "It's other people's assumption that hearing is necessary for a full life. It's the constant pressure to adapt to a world that refuses to adapt to you. It's being treated as incomplete when you're actually experiencing life in ways that hearing people can't imagine." Marcus felt the full weight of her words, understanding for the first time that his entire year of learning and growth had been based on a fundamentally flawed premise. He had approached Emma's deafness as a problem to be solved or accommodated, rather than as a different but equally valid way of being human. "I've been approaching this all wrong," he said quietly. "Not wrong," Emma corrected gently. "Just incomplete. You learned our language and our culture, which is more than most hearing people ever do. But tonight you finally saw us as we actually are, not as people overcoming limitations, but as people living full, rich lives in ways that don't depend on hearing approval or understanding." Marcus nodded, feeling the profound shift in perspective settle over him like a weight he was finally ready to carry. For a year, he had been learning about deaf culture. Tonight he finally understood deaf pride. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Marcus found himself walking with Emma toward the subway station. The March air was crisp but not cold, and the streets were quieter than usual for a Thursday night. "Emma," Marcus began, then stopped, not sure how to articulate what he was feeling. "What is it?" "A year ago I thought you needed the hearing world to make space for you," he said slowly. "Tonight I realize that the hearing world needs you to show us what we've been missing." Emma smiled, the genuine, unreserved smile that Marcus had learned to treasure over their months of friendship. "That," she signed, "might be the most intelligent thing you've ever said to me." They walked in comfortable silence for a few blocks, both processing the significance of the evening in their own ways. Marcus was thinking about all the assumptions he had made, all the ways he had patronized Emma without realizing it, all the energy he had spent trying to help her fit into his world instead of questioning whether his world deserved her presence. "Marcus?" Emma stopped walking and turned to face him. "Yes? Thank you. For what?" "For being willing to have your mind changed," she replied. "For being willing to be wrong about things you thought you understood. For caring enough to keep learning even when the learning was uncomfortable." Marcus felt something expand in his chest. Not romantic love, though that was certainly part of it, but something deeper and more complex. Respect, admiration, gratitude for the way Emma had patiently guided him through his own ignorance toward something approaching wisdom. "Thank you," he replied, "for being patient with my education." As Emma disappeared down the subway steps, Marcus stood on the sidewalk thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. A year ago, he had been a man who saw a woman standing alone and assumed she needed rescue. Tonight, he finally understood that she had never needed rescuing. She had needed the world around her to become worthy of the gifts she had to offer. And for the first time since he had met Emma Rodriguez, Marcus Sterling knew exactly what he wanted to do with the rest of his life. 3 weeks after the Voices in Motion performance, Marcus made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him, including himself. He resigned from Sterling Properties. Not immediately and not without careful planning. He spent 2 weeks working with the board of directors to ensure a smooth transition, recommending his most trusted vice president to take over day-to-day operations while he remained as a consulting member of the board. His father, calling from his retirement home in Palm Beach, was bewildered but not entirely displeased. He had always worried that Marcus lacked the killer instinct necessary for real estate development. "Are you having some kind of midlife crisis?" Eleanor Sterling asked when Marcus broke the news over dinner at her Upper East Side apartment. "You're 30, darling. Isn't it a bit early for this sort of dramatic gesture?" "It's not dramatic, Mom," Marcus replied, though he was speaking aloud rather than signing, a habit he fell back into when dealing with his family. "It's practical. I want to do work that aligns with my values." "And what values are those exactly?" his mother asked, her tone suggesting she found the entire concept somewhat suspicious. Marcus had been thinking about this question for weeks, trying to articulate the shift that had occurred in his worldview over the past year. "I want to use my resources to create opportunities for people who don't have the advantages I was born with," he said finally. "I want to challenge systems that exclude people based on differences that should be celebrated rather than marginalized." His mother's expression suggested she understood the words individually, but found their combination mystifying. "That's very noble, dear, but surely you can do charity work without abandoning your career." "This isn't charity work, Mom," Marcus said, feeling the familiar frustration that came with trying to explain his transformation to people who had known him before it began. "It's justice work. There's a difference." The conversation ended with his mother expressing concern about his mental health and suggesting he take a vacation before making any more life-altering decisions. Marcus left feeling the peculiar loneliness that comes from outgrowing the people who raised you. His plans were still forming, but the general direction was clear. He wanted to establish a foundation focused on accessibility and inclusion, with particular attention to deaf and hard-of-hearing communities. Not because they needed saving, but because American society had been systematically underutilizing their talents and perspectives for generations. Emma's reaction to his career change was characteristically direct. "Are you doing this because of me?" she asked during their Tuesday coffee meeting, her signing carrying a note of concern. "I'm doing this because of what I've learned through knowing you," Marcus replied carefully. "But not for you, if that's what you're worried about." "What's the difference?" Marcus had anticipated this question and had spent considerable time thinking about his answer. "If I were doing this for you, it would be about trying to impress you or win your approval. It would be motivated by my feelings rather than by genuine conviction. But what I've learned through our friendship has changed how I see the world, how I understand justice, how I want to spend my life. That's because of our relationship, but it's not dependent on it." Emma studied him across the small table, her expression unreadable. "And if I told you I wasn't interested in you romantically? If I said I wanted to remain friends but nothing more, would you still make these changes?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because he hadn't considered the possibility, but because Emma's directness forced him to confront his own motivations more honestly than he had been willing to do. "Yes," he said after a long pause, and was surprised to discover he meant it. "My feelings for you were the catalyst, but they're not the foundation anymore. I can't go back to being someone who ignores injustice just because it doesn't affect me personally." Emma nodded slowly, something in her expression suggesting she approved of his answer. Over the next several weeks, Marcus threw himself into the work of establishing what would become the Sterling Foundation for Accessibility and Inclusion. He hired Dr. Jennifer Martinez as his first consultant, asking her to help him understand the landscape of deaf advocacy and education. He met with disability rights lawyers, accessibility experts, and community organizers from various marginalized groups. What he discovered was both inspiring and infuriating. There were brilliant, passionate people working on solutions to problems that could be solved with adequate resources and political will, but they were chronically underfunded and ignored by mainstream institutions. His privilege could actually make a difference, not by swooping in as a savior, but by amplifying voices that had been speaking truth for years without adequate platforms. The Foundation's first major initiative was a partnership with Gallaudet University to create a scholarship program for deaf students pursuing careers in public policy and advocacy. The second was a grant program for small businesses to improve their accessibility for deaf and hard-of-hearing customers and employees. The third was a public education campaign designed to challenge common misconceptions about deafness and deaf culture. Marcus was energized by the work in ways his real estate career had never energized him. Every day brought new challenges that felt meaningful, new connections with people whose perspectives expanded his understanding of the world, new opportunities to use his resources in ways that created genuine positive change. But even as his professional life took on new purpose and direction, his personal feelings for Emma remained unresolved. They continued their Tuesday coffee meetings, continued their friendship, but Marcus found himself increasingly aware of the careful boundaries Emma maintained around anything that might suggest romantic possibility. It wasn't that she was cold or distant. If anything, their friendship had deepened as Marcus's understanding of her world had grown more sophisticated. She shared more of her work with him now, asked for his perspective on advocacy strategies, included him in planning sessions for community events. But there was always a line, always a sense that she was holding part of herself in reserve. The realization that he needed to address this directly came to Marcus on a Thursday evening in May, as he was reviewing grant applications in his new office space. The Foundation had taken over a floor of a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, chosen specifically for its proximity to several deaf community organizations and its accessibility features. Emma had stopped by to drop off materials for an upcoming conference on deaf education policy, and they had ended up in his office discussing the Foundation's next major initiative. As they talked, Marcus found himself studying her face, watching the way her expressions shifted as she explained complex policy issues, admiring the passion that animated her signing when she talked about work she cared about. "You're not listening to me," Emma observed, interrupting his reverie. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, refocusing on their conversation. "You were talking about the federal education bill." "I was talking about it 5 minutes ago," Emma corrected. "For the last few minutes, you've been staring at me with an expression I recognize." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. "What kind of expression?" "The kind that suggests you have something to say that you've been avoiding saying." There it was, Emma's characteristic directness, cutting through his hesitation and forcing him to confront what he had been dancing around for months. "You're right," Marcus admitted. "I do have something to say." "Then say it." Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that what he said next would either deepen their relationship or potentially end it. "I'm in love with you, Emma. I have been for months, maybe since that first night at the coffee shop. I know you asked me to be patient, to let things develop naturally, and I've tried to respect that. But I can't keep pretending that my feelings aren't growing stronger every time I see you." Emma's expression didn't change, but Marcus saw her hands still in her lap, a sign that she was processing what he had said. "I need you to know," Marcus continued, his signing becoming more animated as he tried to express the depth of his feelings, "that when I first saw you at that charity gala, I thought you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. But beauty was all I could see, because I didn't know how to see anything else. Now, after knowing you for over a year, I understand that your beauty is just the most obvious of your extraordinary qualities." Emma remained silent, so Marcus pressed on, feeling like he was standing at the edge of a cliff. "You're brilliant, not just intelligent, but wise in ways that come from really listening to people and understanding their experiences. You're funny in ways that catch me off guard and make me see familiar things from completely new angles. You're brave in ways I'm still learning to appreciate, not the dramatic kind of bravery, but the everyday courage it takes to navigate a world that wasn't designed for you without losing your sense of humor or your compassion for people who don't understand your experience." Marcus paused, watching Emma's face for any sign of how his words were being received. "You're a leader in ways that most people never recognize because they're not looking for leadership that doesn't fit their preconceived notions. You're an artist whose work makes the world more beautiful and more accessible. You're an advocate whose work makes the world more just. And you're a friend who has been patient enough to help me become a better person than I was when I met you." Emma's hands moved slightly, and Marcus thought she might respond, but she remained silent. "I know I have no right to expect anything from you," Marcus continued. "I know that my feelings don't create any obligation on your part. I know that you might not feel the same way, or that you might have very good reasons for not wanting to get involved with someone from my background. But I couldn't keep pretending that friendship was enough for me when what I feel for you is so much deeper than that." Finally, Emma raised her hands to respond. "Are you finished?" she asked, and Marcus couldn't tell from her expression whether that was a good or bad sign. "I think so," he replied, his heart pounding. Emma leaned back in her chair, studying him with the careful attention she brought to everything important in her life. "Marcus," she began, "do you remember what you said to me the first night we had coffee? When I told you I might not be interested in you romantically?" Marcus's stomach clenched as he recalled his answer, that he could handle the possibility that their relationship might not become romantic, that what he couldn't handle was not finding out who she really was. "I remember," he said quietly. "You said you needed to know who I really was," Emma continued. "But I don't think you've ever asked yourself whether I know who you really are." The observation hit Marcus like a physical blow. In all his months of learning about Emma's world, her culture, her experiences, he had never considered whether she might need to understand his world with equal depth. "You're right," he admitted. "I've been so focused on proving that I could understand your world that I never thought about whether you wanted to understand mine." "It's not about wanting," Emma corrected. "It's about needing. If we're going to have any kind of relationship, friendship or otherwise, it has to be based on mutual understanding. I've learned a lot about you over the past year, but most of what I know has been filtered through your own interpretations of your experiences. I've never seen you in your natural habitat. I've never met your friends who aren't connected to the deaf community. I've never seen how you handle conflict or stress or failure when you can't retreat into the comfortable role of the hearing person learning about deaf culture." Marcus absorbed her words, recognizing their truth and their challenge. "What are you saying?" he asked. "I'm saying that if you want me to consider the possibility of something more than friendship, you need to let me see all of who you are, not just the version of yourself that you've become through knowing me." Emma stood up, gathering the materials she had brought for the conference. "I'm not rejecting you, Marcus," she said, her signing gentle but firm. "But I'm not accepting you either, not yet. If your feelings are as deep and genuine as you say they are, then you should want me to make an informed decision based on complete information." As she prepared to leave, Emma paused at the office door. "There's a Sterling Properties Board meeting next Tuesday, isn't there?" she asked. Marcus nodded, surprised by the question. "I want to attend," Emma said, "as your guest, but also as someone who wants to understand the world you came from and the world you're still partially connected to. If you're serious about wanting a real relationship with me, then I need to see you in contexts where I'm not the focus, where you're not performing your growth for my benefit." After Emma left, Marcus sat in his office staring out at the Brooklyn skyline, processing what had just happened. She hadn't rejected his declaration of love, but she had challenged him in ways he hadn't expected. She wanted to see him in his original context, wanted to understand not just who he had become, but who he had been. The prospect was terrifying. The Sterling Properties Board meetings were everything Emma had criticized about his former world, dominated by wealthy white men, focused on profit over people, characterized by the kind of casual exclusion and unconscious bias that he had only recently learned to recognize. Taking Emma into that environment would be like stripping away all the growth and change of the past year and showing her the person he used to be. But as Marcus thought about Emma's challenge, he realized she was asking him to do exactly what he had been asking her to do for over a year: trust someone else enough to be fully seen and understood. If he wanted her to open her heart to the possibility of love, he needed to be willing to open his entire life to her scrutiny. The next Tuesday, for the first time in over a year, Marcus Sterling would enter a Sterling Properties Board meeting not as someone trying to escape his past, but as someone ready to integrate all the parts of himself into a coherent whole that Emma Rodriguez could evaluate and, hopefully, choose to love. The Sterling Properties boardroom had not changed in the years since Marcus had stepped back from active management of the company. The same imposing mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by leather chairs that had been occupied by the same group of men for the better part of 2 decades. The same oil paintings of Manhattan real estate developments hung on the walls, and the same sense of insular power filled the room like expensive cologne. But as Marcus entered the boardroom with Emma beside him, he saw it all through completely different eyes. Emma was dressed in a sharp navy blazer and professional skirt, her auburn hair pulled back in a style that suggested serious business. She carried herself with the confident bearing of someone who belonged in any room she chose to enter. But Marcus could see the subtle signs of her alertness, the way her eyes swept the room, cataloging exits and lighting, the way she positioned herself where she could see everyone's faces clearly. The reaction to Emma's presence was immediate and telling. Conversations faltered as the 12 board members registered the presence of a woman they didn't recognize. Marcus watched as their eyes moved from Emma to him, clearly wondering who she was and why she was there. "Gentlemen," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority that had been bred into him from childhood, "I'd like you to meet Emma Rodriguez. Emma is a graphic designer and disability rights advocate who has been advising me on accessibility initiatives for the Sterling Foundation." The introductions that followed revealed everything Emma needed to know about Marcus's former world. Several board members shook her hand while speaking to Marcus, as if she were an extension of him rather than a person in her own right. Others made exaggerated efforts to speak slowly and clearly, apparently assuming that all disabilities were the same. Robert Hartwell, whom Marcus had confronted at the museum gala, greeted Emma with the kind of patronizing warmth that suggested he thought he was being remarkably enlightened. "How wonderful that Marcus is branching out into social work," Hartwell said to Emma, his tone suggesting he was speaking to a child. "It's so important for people like him to give back to the less fortunate." Marcus felt his jaw clench, but before he could respond, Emma stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Actually, Mr. Hartwell," she said, her speech careful but clear, she had chosen to use her voice rather than signing. A strategic decision that Marcus recognized. "I think you'll find that the deaf community has quite a lot to offer the business world, particularly in areas of visual communication, attention to detail, and innovative problem-solving. We're not really the recipients of charity so much as an underutilized resource." The subtle correction in her phrasing, from "people like me" to "the deaf community," was lost on Hartwell. But Marcus caught it and felt a surge of admiration for the way she had claimed her identity while simultaneously challenging his assumptions. As the meeting progressed, Marcus found himself seeing his former colleagues with new clarity. These were men who had shaped his understanding of success, leadership, and business ethics for most of his adult life. They were intelligent, accomplished, and undeniably powerful. They were also, Marcus realized with growing discomfort, remarkably narrow in their thinking. The agenda focused on 3 major development projects, each of which involved displacing lower-income communities to build luxury housing or commercial spaces. The discussion was conducted entirely in terms of profit margins, zoning challenges, and political obstacles to be overcome. There was no mention of the people who would be affected by these developments, no consideration of community input or social impact. Marcus watched Emma's face as the men around the table discussed a proposed luxury condo development in Queens that would require the demolition of a community center that served deaf and hard-of-hearing families. She remained professionally composed, but he could see the tightness around her eyes as she listened to the casual dismissal of community concerns. "The community center situation is a minor hurdle," board member Charles Fitzgerald was saying. "A modest donation to help them relocate should smooth over any opposition." "Have you asked the community what they actually need?" Emma asked quietly. The room fell silent. It was clear that no one had expected her to participate in the discussion. "I'm sorry?" Fitzgerald said, looking confused. "The community center," Emma repeated, her voice still calm, but carrying an edge of steel. "Have you asked the people who use it what they would need in order to relocate successfully? Or are you assuming that a donation will be sufficient compensation for losing a space that may have taken years to make fully accessible? Marcus felt the temperature in the room shift. These men were not accustomed to being challenged, particularly not by someone they clearly viewed as an outsider. "I'm sure we'll take all relevant factors into account," Hartwell said dismissively, clearly hoping to move past Emma's questions. "What factors do you consider relevant?" Emma pressed, and Marcus realized she was not going to let this go. "Property values, zoning compliance, environmental impact studies," Fitzgerald replied, his tone suggesting these should be obvious. "Community impact?" Emma asked. "We'll comply with all legal requirements for community notification and input," another board member said defensively. "That's not what I asked," Emma replied calmly. "I asked about community impact. Legal compliance is a minimum standard, not a comprehensive approach to development that affects people's lives." Marcus watched the faces around the table as Emma spoke. He could see confusion, irritation, and in some cases genuine surprise that someone would question their methods. These were men who had built fortunes by viewing real estate development as a purely financial endeavor, and Emma's questions were challenging the fundamental assumptions that had guided their careers. "Miss Rodriguez," Hartwell said, his voice taking on the condescending tone Marcus had heard him use with employees he wanted to dismiss. "I understand you have concerns, but I think you may not fully grasp the complexities of large-scale development projects." Emma's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "You're right, Mr. Hartwell. I don't fully grasp how you can plan to destroy a community resource without consulting the community it serves. Perhaps you could explain that complexity to me." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus realized he had reached a crossroads that would define not only his relationship with Emma, but his understanding of who he wanted to be in the world. "Emma raises an important point," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "The Sterling Foundation has been researching community impact assessment protocols, and we've found that traditional approaches to development often fail to account for the full range of services that community spaces provide." He could feel the surprise from his former colleagues. They had expected him to manage Emma, to smooth over her challenging questions, not to amplify them. Marcus, his father's former business partner, James Sterling Sr., said carefully, "Perhaps we could discuss this in more detail after the meeting?" "No," Marcus replied, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "I think this is exactly the kind of discussion we should be having in this room, with these people, about these projects." For the next hour, Marcus found himself in the strange position of questioning developments he would have approved without hesitation a year earlier. With Emma's sharp questions and informed perspective guiding the discussion, he began to see patterns in Sterling Properties' approach that he had never noticed. The consistent prioritization of profit over community input, the casual dismissal of social impact, the assumption that money could solve any problem created by displacement. Emma didn't attack or condemn. Instead, she asked pointed questions that revealed the limitations of the company's approach. She inquired about accessibility features in the proposed developments, about community input processes, about long-term social and economic impacts on existing residents. Her questions weren't hostile, but they were relentless, and they exposed how little thought had been given to the human cost of the projects under discussion. By the time the meeting ended, Marcus could feel the shift in the room's dynamics. His former colleagues were polite, but clearly uncomfortable with the direction the discussion had taken. Several made comments about outside perspectives and maintaining focus on core business objectives that were obviously directed at Emma's participation. As they left the building, Emma was quiet for several blocks. Marcus waited, knowing she was processing what she had witnessed. "Now I understand," she finally said, choosing to sign rather than speak. "Understand what?" "Why your transformation has been so profound," Emma replied. "Those men aren't evil, but they live in a world so removed from the consequences of their decisions that they've lost the ability to see people as anything other than obstacles to profit." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of recognition. "That was my world for 10 years. Those were the people who shaped my understanding of success and leadership. And you walked away from it. I walked away from the active participation, Marcus corrected. But as you just saw, I'm still connected to it. I still have influence there, and I still benefit from the wealth it generates. Emma studied his face as they walked. The question is, what are you going to do with that influence and that wealth? That evening, back in his apartment, Marcus made a series of phone calls that would reshape Sterling Properties' approach to community development. He used his influence as a founding board member to establish new protocols for community impact assessment, to create requirements for accessibility in all new developments, and to institute a community advisory process that would give affected residents genuine input into projects that would affect their neighborhoods. It wasn't a complete transformation. Changing institutional culture takes years, not hours, but it was a beginning. And more importantly, it was a demonstration to Emma that his evolution from privileged real estate heir to social justice advocate wasn't just personal growth, but a fundamental reorientation of his values and priorities. 3 days later, Emma invited him to dinner at her apartment in Astoria. It was the first time Marcus had been to Emma's home, and he was struck by how perfectly the space reflected her personality. The apartment was small but thoughtfully organized, with excellent lighting and clear sightlines throughout. The walls were covered with her own artwork, bold, geometric pieces that played with light and shadow in ways that suggested visual experience beyond the merely decorative. I wanted to cook for you, Emma explained as she set the table, because I wanted to see you in my space, eating food I prepared, having a conversation where I set the terms. Marcus understood. Just as she had needed to see him in his original context, she wanted him to experience her world on her terms, in her space, according to her rhythms and preferences. The meal was simple but delicious, grilled salmon with vegetables from the small garden she maintained on her fire escape. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the natural quiet that Marcus had learned to appreciate in Emma's presence. I've been thinking about what you said, Emma finally signed, setting down her fork. About your feelings for me. Marcus's heart rate accelerated, but he forced himself to remain calm. And? I've been thinking about my feelings for you too. What have you concluded? Emma smiled, the genuine, unguarded expression that Marcus treasured above all others. I've concluded that I was wrong when I first met you at that coffee shop a year ago. Wrong how? I told you that if your feelings were based on fantasy rather than reality, you might discover that once you got to know me. But I think the opposite happened. Marcus waited, not daring to interrupt. The more I've gotten to know you, really know you, not just the version of yourself you were trying to become, the more I've come to care about you. Not the wealthy heir who was trying to redeem himself, and not just the reformed advocate who learned sign language, but you, Marcus, the man who questions his own assumptions, who listens more than he speaks, who uses his privilege to amplify other people's voices rather than his own. Marcus felt something expand in his chest that was too complex to be called simple joy. When you stood up to those men in the boardroom, Emma continued, when you used your position to challenge systems you used to be part of, I realized something that I'd been avoiding admitting to myself. What? I realized that I wasn't just evaluating whether you were worthy of my romantic interest. I was falling in love with you despite myself, and it scared me because I'd never been with someone whose world was so different from mine. Marcus felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. And now? Now I understand that our worlds don't have to be the same for us to build something together, but they do have to be compatible. And after watching you navigate between your old world and your new one, after seeing how you've integrated all the parts of yourself into someone I respect and admire and care about. Emma paused, her hands still for a moment as she gathered her thoughts. Marcus Sterling, she signed, her movements precise and deliberate. I'm in love with you too. The words hung in the air between them, and Marcus felt a shift that was both seismic and subtle. This wasn't the dramatic declaration he had imagined for over a year. It was something quieter and more profound, the recognition of two people who had seen each other completely and chosen to build something together. There's something I need to tell you, Marcus said, his signing suddenly urgent. What? When I saw you for the first time at that charity gala, I thought you were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, and I wanted to rescue you from your isolation." Emma's eyebrows rose slightly. "And now? Now I know that you were never isolated. You were just temporarily in a space that couldn't recognize your value. The isolation was never yours. It belonged to everyone who didn't know how to see you." Emma's smile was radiant. "And that's when you finally understood." "That's when I finally understood," Marcus agreed, "that some people don't need our pity or our help. They need our respect, our willingness to learn, and our commitment to changing the world that isolates them instead of asking them to change themselves, to fit into our limited understanding of what it means to be whole." Emma reached across the small table and took his hands in hers, the first intentionally. Romantic gesture they had shared in over a year of friendship. "He saw everyone ignore the deaf girl," she said, completing the title that had brought them together, until he asked her to marry him when he understood that she had never been the one who was truly alone. Marcus felt his breath catch. "Is that a hypothetical completion of the title?" he asked carefully. "Or are you asking me a question?" Emma's laugh was clear and joyous. "Marcus Sterling," she signed with mock seriousness. "Are you really going to make me propose to you?" "Emma Rodriguez," Marcus replied, standing up and dropping to one knee beside her chair. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she signed, pulling him up to kiss her for the first time. "But only because you finally learned to listen with your eyes and speak with your heart." As they held each other in Emma's small apartment, surrounded by her artwork and the life she had built entirely through her own intelligence and determination, Marcus understood that the journey that had begun with his humiliating flight from a deaf woman at a charity gala had led him not just to love, but to a fundamental understanding of what it meant to be human in a world full of other humans, each with their own languages, experiences, and gifts to offer. He had learned to sign, but more importantly, he had learned to see. He had gained fluency in ASL, but more importantly, he had gained fluency in humility, in growth, in the recognition that every person he met had something to teach him about the vast, complex, beautiful diversity of human experience. And Emma, brilliant, patient, challenging Emma, had been the teacher who had guided him from ignorance through education to understanding, and finally to love that was based not on fantasy or projection, but on the reality of two people who had chosen to see each other completely and build a life together that honored both of their worlds. In the end, Marcus realized the title had been wrong from the beginning. He hadn't seen everyone ignore the deaf girl and then asked her to marry him when he understood something about her. He had seen everyone ignore the deaf girl and then spent a year learning to understand something about himself and about a world much larger and more complex than he had ever imagined. The real story was simpler and more profound. Two people from different worlds had found a way to build a bridge between their experiences, and in doing so, had discovered that love, real love, wasn't about saving each other, but about growing together into the people they were capable of becoming.